What would you do if you found a heavy gold ring shaped like a winged skull in the dirt? For 23-year-old waitress Chloe, picking up that piece of jewelry was a fatal mistake. Within 24 hours, the Hells Angels locked down her town, and she became their prime suspect. The town of Caliente, Nevada, wasn't a place people moved to. It was a place people ended up, flanked by barren red rock and a stretch of Highway 93 that seemed to stretch into eternity. It was a dusty pit stop for truckers, road trippers, and ghosts. Chloe Henderson had been working the late shift at the Copper Skillet Diner for 3 years, saving every wrinkled dollar bill she earned to pay her way through a nursing program in Reno. She knew every local by their coffee order and every transient by the tired look in their eyes. But the man who walked into the diner at 11:45 p.m. on a wind-blown Tuesday didn't look tired. He looked like a storm looking for a place to break. The bell above the door didn't just jingle. It slammed against the glass as he pushed his way inside. He was a mountain of a man, clad in heavily scuffed dark denim and a thick leather vest. The air in the diner instantly seemed to grow cold. Chloe, wiping down the laminated surface of the counter, froze. She didn't need to be a biker aficionado to recognize the infamous Death Head logo, the winged skull embroidered on the back of his vest. Above it, the top rocker read Hells Angels, and below it, the bottom rocker declared Oakland. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. The two elderly truckers in the corner booth suddenly found their lukewarm coffee incredibly fascinating, lowering their heads and avoiding eye contact. The biker took a seat at the furthest stool, the leather of his vest groaning as he settled. His massive hands, covered in faded tattoos and thick silver rings, rested flat on the counter. His knuckles were raw, the skin split and angry red, as if he had recently used them to shatter bone. "Black coffee," he rumbled. His voice was like gravel being crushed under a tire. "And a slice of whatever pie is fresh." Chloe swallowed hard, pasting on her best customer service smile, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured the coffee. "Cherry, sir. Baked it this morning. This," he merely grunted. For 20 agonizing minutes. The only sounds in the copper skillet were the buzzing of the neon sign outside and the scrape of the man's fork against the ceramic plate. When he finished, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $50 bill, and tossed it onto the counter. He stood up, adjusted his heavy belt, and strode out the door without waiting for his change. Chloe let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. She watched through the grease-stained window as he kicked over a massive, customized Harley-Davidson. The engine roared to life with a deafening, chest-rattling boom, tearing out of the gravel parking lot and disappearing into the pitch-black desert night. It wasn't until Chloe went out to lock the front doors at 2 a.m. and take the trash to the dumpsters that she saw it. The wind had picked up, swirling desert dust around her ankles. There, glinting under the flickering pale yellow light of the parking lot lamp, was a piece of metal half buried in the loose gravel, right where the biker had parked his Harley. Chloe knelt, brushing the dirt away. It was a ring, but calling it a ring felt like a profound understatement. It was a massive, incredibly heavy piece of solid gold and silver. The face of it was deeply engraved with the unmistakable winged skull. Flanking the skull were the numbers 8 and 1, representing the 8th and 1st letters of the alphabet, H and A. On the inside of the thick band, she could see a tiny engraving, A for Angels, forever. Forever Angels. A chill shot down her spine. The raw weight of it in her palm felt dangerous. It felt like something that didn't belong to the normal world. She slipped it into the pocket of her apron, finished dragging the trash bags to the dumpster, and locked up the diner, her heart hammering against her ribs. When Chloe got back to her cramped, single-story rental house on the edge of town, her older brother, Jackson, was still awake, covered in motor oil and tinkering with a carburetor at the kitchen table. Jackson worked at the only auto shop in Caliente and knew every inch of engine mechanics and road law. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Jackson noted, wiping his greasy hands on a rag as she locked the deadbolt behind her with entirely too much force. Chloe didn't say a word. She reached into her apron pocket and dropped the heavy ring onto the Formica kitchen table. It landed with a dense, authoritative thud. Jackson's eyes dropped to the piece of jewelry. All the color instantly drained from his face. He didn't reach for it. He didn't even want his hands near it. He slowly backed his chair away from the table. "Chloe," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Where did you get that?" "A guy left it at the diner tonight. He dropped it in the parking lot. Big guy, leather vest, from Oakland. Do you have any idea what this is?" Jackson's breathing hitched. He finally reached out with the tip of his screwdriver and nudged the ring to see the side. "Oh, God, it has the filthy few diamond on the side. Chloe, you need to listen to me very, very carefully." Chloe felt a knot of pure panic tighten in her stomach. "What, I was just going to give it to the local police in the morning. Let Sheriff Miller deal with it." "No," Jackson snapped, louder than he intended. "You do not involve the cops. This isn't a lost wallet. Chloe, this is a Hell's Angels Club ring. In their world, this is a sacred piece of property. The club owns it, not the individual. A patch member losing his ring or his colors is a massive violation. If the wrong people find out he lost it, he's in deep trouble with his own brothers. And if they find out a civilian like you has it..." Jackson swallowed hard. "They might think you stole it. Or worse, that you disrespected the club. People have disappeared for a lot less. So what do I do?" Chloe panicked, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. "I can't just throw it away. If they come looking for it and find out I threw it in the trash, they'll kill me." "We mail it," Jackson said, thinking rapidly. "Tomorrow. We put it in an unmarked envelope, no return address, and we mail it to the Oakland clubhouse. We wipe it for prints. We never, ever speak of this again. It was a solid plan. It was the safest option. But fate in the Nevada desert is rarely kind, and time was a luxury Chloe and Jackson no longer had." Wednesday morning began exactly like every other morning in Caliente. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the asphalt, and the wind kicked up the usual dust devils. Chloe arrived at the Copper Skillet at 8 a.m., exhausted. She hadn't slept a wink. The massive gold and silver ring felt like a radioactive isotope wrapped in a napkin inside her purse, tucked securely behind the diner's counter. She had planned to hit the post office on her lunch break, exactly as Jackson had instructed. At 9:15 a.m., the diner was moderately busy. Pete, the fry cook and owner, was slamming spatulas against the griddle, while a mix of locals and passing tourists quietly ate their eggs and bacon. Then, the ground began to vibrate. It didn't start as a sound, it started as a physical sensation. The coffee in the glass carafes began to ripple, exactly like the water glass in Jurassic Park. The heavy diner mugs jittered against their saucers. Then came the noise. It was a low, guttural, synchronized roar that seemed to swallow the entire town. It sounded like a squadron of bombers flying 10 feet off the ground. Pete stopped scraping the griddle. The tourists stopped eating. Chloe's blood turned to ice water. She walked slowly to the front window and peered through the blinds. Down the center of Highway 93, a terrifying procession was approaching. It wasn't one or two bikers. It was a column, riding two abreast in perfect, militaristic formation. 10, 20, 40. There had to be at least 50 heavily customized Harley-Davidsons, their chrome gleaming fiercely under the desert sun. Leading the pack were riders flying the notorious red and white patches of the Hells Angels. The town of Caliente reacted on pure, primal instinct. Down the street, the hardware store owner frantically pulled down his metal security grate. Cars parked along the main drag abruptly started up and tore down side streets, desperate to get out of the way. Pedestrians literally vanished, bolting into alleys and storefronts. "Chloe," Pete said, his voice unusually high-pitched. "Lock the door." But it was too late. The column didn't pass through town. As the lead rider reached the copper skillet, he raised a single, gloved fist into the air. The entire pack slowed, their engines dropping to an idle that shook the diner's plate glass windows in their frames. They swarmed the gravel parking lot, surrounding the building in a sea of leather, steel, and exhaust smoke. They parked with practiced precision, kicking down their kickstands in unison. Chloe stood frozen behind the cash register, her purse resting on the shelf below, less than a foot from her shaking knees. Inside that purse was a piece of their brotherhood. The front door didn't jingle. It was practically torn off its hinges as 5 massive men strode inside. They didn't look like the lone rider from the night before. They looked organized. They looked furious. At the front was a man who seemed to take up the entire doorway. He had a thick, graying beard, dark sunglasses, and a terrifying scar that jagged down his cheek and disappeared into his collar. The patch on his chest read, "President." Behind him was a younger, fiercely athletic man whose patch read, "Ace GT," at arms. The diner fell dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. The only sound was the sizzling of bacon left unattended on Pete's griddle. "Which one of you is running this joint?" the president asked. His voice was completely calm, devoid of any shouting or theatrics, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Pete, wiping his hands on a greasy towel, stepped out from the kitchen, trembling. I am Pete Donovan. Can I get you gentlemen something to eat? We're not here for the eggs." "Pete," the president said smoothly, removing his sunglasses. His eyes were cold, calculating, and dead. "We're here because we have a problem, and we think your little establishment is right in the middle of it." Chloe felt her vision blur around the edges. She squeezed her eyes shut for a microsecond, willing herself not to faint. "They know," she thought wildly. "They know I have the ring." The sergeant-at-arms stepped forward, slamming a heavy combat boot onto the bottom rung of a bar stool. "Last night, one of our brothers rode through this town. Big guy. Name's Bear. O'Connor. He stopped here around midnight for coffee." Chloe's heart stopped. She nodded slowly, instinctively, before she could stop herself. The sergeant-at-arms locked eyes with her. "You served him, sweetheart." Yes," Chloe whispered, her vocal cords feeling like sandpaper. "Black coffee, cherry pie, Kerry. Well, ain't that sweet," the president said, his voice dropping an octave. "Here's the problem. Chloe. Bear never made it to his destination. A trucker found him this morning, dumped in a dry wash about 8 miles south of here. Somebody ran him off the road. Somebody took a crowbar to his skull. He's in a medically induced coma at the county hospital. The room spun. Chloe gripped the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. The biker from last night hadn't just carelessly lost his ring. He had been ambushed. Now, the president continued, taking a slow step closer to the counter, his massive frame towering over Chloe. Bear is a tough son of a bitch. Whoever hit him, it wasn't a fair fight. They left his bike. They left his wallet. But they took something else. They took his club ring. Chloe stopped breathing. The air in the diner felt utterly devoid of oxygen. The ring in her purse suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "We track our own," the sergeant-at-arms growled, leaning over the counter so close Chloe could smell the stale tobacco and peppermint on his breath. Word on the highway is, some local desert rats were eyeing him when he rode through. We think whoever ambushed him watched him leave this diner. We think whoever took his ring is right here in Caliente. The president slammed his massive, ring-covered hand flat on the laminated counter, making Chloe jump violently. So I'm going to ask you once, sweetheart, and you better think very, very carefully before you answer. What did you see last night? Who was in here? And do you know anything about a gold-winged skull? If Chloe told the truth, if she reached into her purse and handed them the ring, they wouldn't believe she just found it. Not after learning their brother had been brutally beaten and robbed. In their eyes, whoever possessed that ring was either the attacker or an accomplice to the ambush. She would be signing her own death warrant, and probably her brother Jackson's, too. But if she lied, and they somehow found it on her, or if someone saw her pick it up last night, 50 Hell's Angels were standing outside. 5 of their most dangerous leaders were inside, and the most incriminating piece of evidence in Nevada was resting less than 12 inches from Chloe's shaking hands. Chloe started, looking into the dead eyes of the club president, her mind racing desperately for a way out. Chloe started, looking into the dead, unblinking eyes of the club president. Her mind raced desperately for a way out, her pulse pounding a frantic rhythm against her eardrums. I served him. Just like I said. He drank his coffee, ate his pie, and left. He didn't speak to anyone. He just rode off south. The president leaned in closer. His name tag read Dutch. Nobody followed him. No locals hanging around the parking lot. No. Chloe lied, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the sheer terror gripping her lungs. Just 2 out-of-state truckers in the corner booth, and they left an hour after he did. I locked up alone. Dutch stared at her for what felt like an eternity. He was a human lie detector, hardened by decades of outlaw life. He narrowed his eyes, studying the subtle trembling of her hands resting on the counter, inches above her hidden purse. He opened his mouth to speak, but the sudden wail of police sirens shattered the heavy silence. Through the plate-glass window, 2 Caliente Sheriff's Department cruisers skidded into the gravel lot, their light bars flashing frantically, casting harsh red and blue shadows over the sea of parked Harley-Davidsons. The local law enforcement was vastly outnumbered. 50-2. The diner door swung open, and Sheriff Miller stepped in, looking visibly pale and sweating through his khaki uniform. Right behind him was Deputy Sullivan, a heavily built, arrogant local who had a reputation for being a bully with a badge. "All right, everyone just take a breath," Sheriff Miller announced, his hand resting nervously on his duty belt. "Dutch, you and your boys are causing a panic. You need to clear out of Caliente." Dutch slowly turned away from Chloe, his lips curling into a cold, menacing smile. "Miller, your town is bleeding onto my club's boots. One of my brothers was nearly beaten to death down in Miller's Wash last night, and whoever did it took his club ring. We aren't leaving until we find the rat who swung the crowbar." Deputy Sullivan pushed past the sheriff, puffing out his chest. "We're handling the investigation. Dutch, your biker buddy probably got drunk and wrecked his own ride. Now get your gang out of my jurisdiction before I start making arrests." As Sullivan stepped forward into the diner's harsh fluorescent light, Chloe's eyes darted down. Caliente was a dusty town, surrounded by pale, dry dirt. But the dry wash 8 miles south, the place where Bear had been found dumped, was a dried-up riverbed famous for its thick, rust-red clay. Caked deep into the treads of Deputy Sullivan's black duty boots, and splattered across the hem of his uniform trousers, was fresh, damp red clay. Chloe's breath hitched, She looked at Sullivan's hands. His right hand was resting on his belt, and his knuckles were visibly bruised and swollen. He did it, Chloe realized, a sickening wave of adrenaline washing over her. Sullivan followed Bear out of the diner. He used his cruiser to run the Harley off the road. He beat him with a crowbar. Sullivan wasn't looking for the ring. He probably turned Bear's pockets inside out, looking for cash or the ring, and came up empty. Unaware that Bear had already dropped it in the diner parking lot before the ambush even happened. You aren't arresting anyone. Sullivan. Dutch growled, stepping into the deputy's personal space. The size difference was staggering. Dutch made the bulky deputy look like a child. In fact, I think you locals are covering for the scum who did this. Watch your mouth. Biker! Sullivan spat, his hand twitching toward his holstered sidearm. The tension in the room snapped tight as piano wire. The sergeant-at-arms unclipped a heavy folding knife from his belt. Pete the fry cook whimpered and ducked behind the grill. A bloodbath was seconds away from erupting right in the middle of the copper skillet. Chloe knew she had exactly one chance to redirect the crosshairs. If they searched her to secure the room, they would find the ring in her purse. She had to shift Dutch's full attention, permanently, onto the man who actually committed the crime. "Excuse me," Chloe said. Her voice was loud, cutting through the standoff. Every eye in the diner snapped to her. Dutch turned his head, his scarred face twisted in annoyance. Sullivan glared at her, his eyes silently threatening her to shut up. I just remembered something," Chloe stammered, stepping out from behind the counter, leaving her purse behind. She pointed a shaking finger at Sullivan's boots. "Deputy Sullivan, you came in for coffee late last night, after my shift. You were parked down the road, I remember, because of the mud." Sullivan's face drained of all color. "Shut up. Chloe, you don't know what you're talking about." "The red clay," Chloe continued, her voice gaining strength as she looked directly at Dutch. "There's no red mud in town. It hasn't rained here in a month. The only place with wet red clay right now is the underground spring down at Miller's Wash, exactly where your friend was found." Dutch's eyes slowly tracked down to Deputy Sullivan's boots. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The sergeant-at-arms moved with terrifying speed, stepping laterally to block the diner's exit. Sheriff Miller looked at his deputy, shock registering on his face. "Sullivan, were you out at the wash last night? Your radio was dark for 2 hours." "She's lying!" Sullivan shouted, genuine panic cracking his arrogant facade. He took a step back, his hand gripping the butt of his gun. "This little waitress is just trying to protect her own skin. They probably stole the biker's ring themselves." "Ring," Dutch echoed softly. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. "I didn't say what kind of jewelry was stolen. Deputy, I just said club ring. Could have been a pinky ring. Could have been a necklace. How did you know it was a ring?" Sullivan froze. He had slipped. In his desperate panic to frame Chloe, he had revealed details of the robbery that only the attacker would know. "Take his gun," Dutch ordered, his voice echoing like thunder. Before Sullivan could unholster his weapon, the sergeant-at-arms and 2 other massive angels descended on him. It was a brutally efficient takedown. They slammed the deputy face first into the diner counter, disarming him in a fraction of a second. The metallic clatter of Sullivan's service pistol hitting the linoleum floor sounded like a gunshot. "Sheriff," Dutch said, not taking his eyes off the struggling deputy. "I suggest you step outside and look the other way. Or you can join your boy on the floor." Sheriff Miller, vastly outgunned, and realizing his own deputy was a corrupt, murderous thief, slowly raised his hands and backed out the front door, leaving Sullivan to the wolves. "Let's go check the trunk of his cruiser. Brothers." The sergeant-at-arms growled, hauling a bleeding Sullivan to his feet by the collar of his uniform. "I bet we'll find a bloody tire iron and some fresh dents on his push bumper." As the Angels dragged the screaming deputy out the front door of the diner, the rest of the pack outside surged forward, swarming the police cruiser like angry hornets. The chaotic distraction was absolute. Chloe knew this was her window. It was the only one she would ever get. She ducked behind the counter, unzipped her purse, and grabbed the heavy gold-winged skull ring. She shoved it deep into the pocket of her jeans. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely feel her fingers. She walked quickly out the front door of the diner, stepping onto the porch. The parking lot was a madhouse. 50 bikers were crowding around the police car. The sergeant-at-arms had popped the trunk and pulled out a heavy steel crowbar, the tip stained with dried, dark blood. The roar of fury from the Hells Angels shook the ground. Dutch's custom Harley-Davidson was parked just 3 feet from the diner steps. Attached to the rear fender was a pair of thick, unbuckled black leather saddlebags. Heart in her throat, praying to any god that would listen. Chloe stepped off the porch. She pretended to stumble, bracing herself against the leather seat of Dutch's bike. With a sleight of hand, born of pure, unadulterated terror, she slipped her hand into her pocket, palmed the heavy gold ring, and let it drop silently into the dark depths of the leather saddlebag. She immediately stepped back, pressing her back against the diner wall, hyperventilating. Dutch turned away from the commotion at the police car and walked back toward his bike. He stopped and looked at Chloe, his cold, dead eyes studying her pale, terrified face. He didn't say a word. He simply reached into his leather vest, pulled out a thick wad of cash, peeled off a crisp $100 bill, and flicked it onto the gravel at Chloe's feet. "For the broken door," Dutch rumbled. He swung his massive leg over his Harley and kicked the engine to life. The deafening roar signaled the rest of the pack. They released Sullivan, leaving him beaten and handcuffed to the steering wheel of his own cruiser for the state police to find, the bloody crowbar resting on his lap as evidence. Within 60 seconds, the entire column of Hells Angels peeled out of the Copper Skillet parking lot, tearing down Highway 93, leaving nothing but a massive cloud of dust and the smell of exhaust in their wake. Chloe slid down the brick wall of the diner, collapsing onto the gravel, tears finally spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. She was alive. The ring was gone, returned to the president without him ever knowing she possessed it. The corrupt deputy had met his fate. And Caliente, Nevada, would never be the same. Later that night, as Jackson held a trembling Chloe in their small kitchen, they listened to the police scanner. State troopers had arrested Sullivan for attempted murder and highway robbery, and hundreds of miles away, rolling into the Oakland clubhouse, a president would unpack his saddlebags, find a sacred piece of gold nestled among his gear, and believe that the Brotherhood's guardian angels had simply brought it home. Did Chloe make the right move, or was it pure luck that saved her from the angels' wrath? Drop a comment below with what you would have done in her shoes. If this real-life desert thriller kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more crazy true stories. See you in the next video.